So just popping in before you guys watch this video to say that this is not a diverse list of authors. These are all white female authors, and while all of these books were on my to read list of things that I did want to read, it's also my responsibility to make sure that I'm consuming a diverse group of perspectives, and that is definitely something that I am more aware of, especially after making this video and making that connection. And there's plenty of things on my list that, aren't white female authors, but also the fact that these are all white female authors is very one perspective. And so that's something that I just wanted to bring attention to before you guys watch this video. I think I'll probably make more videos about reviewing books because I do really enjoy it, and I've been reading more just because of COVID. So there's that. But yeah, I just wanted to let you all know that that is something that I am aware of and that you should be aware of going into this video. And yeah. Hello everyone. So today I'm finally making a book review video, which I said I was going to do months ago and haven't. So here we are. I'm basically just going to be reviewing, talking about, discussing, praising the books that I read in quarantine / since March. And I say in quarantine because most of these books were read the first 2 months that I was home, where I was self-isolating. Once I went back to work, I definitely did not read as much because my brain was just tired. And I wanted things that were less emotionally interesting, to be completely honest. So most of these were read within a 2-month period, but I have read a few of them post that. So we're gonna get into it. I'm gonna talk about it. I'm gonna try not to spoil some things. I think some of them I might spoil, but I will announce that I'm going to spoil them. So here we go. All right, the first book that I'm going to be talking about is Where the Crawdads Sing. So I'm starting with this because I have so many thoughts on this book. I heard rave reviews about Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, and I really trust Goodreads, to be honest. I've had good luck with the books that I have referred to Goodreads for, and it has 4.48 stars on Goodreads. So I was awesome, that's a really high review rate. And it's also set in North Carolina, which if you didn't know, is where I'm from and where I currently am and have been for the last 6 months. And this is where I grew up, so obviously there's a bit a lot of an emotional connection there with just the landscape and the setting. So I was really eager to read a book set in North Carolina because I always find that really interesting, naturally, just because there's more that you can relate to, and it's cool to see a totally different story in a place that you are familiar with. Despite all of this, despite this anticipation, I was so disappointed by this book, and I do not say that lightly. I know that I'm in the vast minority when I say that I borderline hated this book, but that almost makes my feelings stronger, because I think when you have a book that everybody's yeah, this book sucks, and you read it and you're yeah, this book sucks, it's okay, we all think that. But when there's this book that's praised and you don't like it and you're why did people love this so much, it makes me hate it even more almost. And I'm very eager to hear other people's opinions on it. I think that has also fueled the fire of why I dislike this book, because it is so loved and I don't get it. So first off, I can really appreciate a lot of the concepts and things talked about in this book, and I think it really has a lot of potential to go into some of the things that it begins to tackle in the book, like masculinity, gender roles, isolation, all within the 50s and 60s. I just do not think that it was done well. But on the topic of positive things, I do think there was some beautiful descriptions and images used with the natural terrain, which again kind of spurs from me being from here and raised here, so I can understand that and appreciate that, and that's one of the things that I love the most about North Carolina. And so being able to read words that respect that, I really appreciated. Okay, now is when I'm going to spoil some things, because I can't talk about this book without talking about the details of it. The biggest thing, honestly, I had with this book is that there is a very inappropriate relationship that is totally romanticized throughout most of the book. So it is with a 19-year-old boy and a 14 or 15-year-old girl, and he's very much a father figure for her, and it teaches her, and it follows into the trope of the man saving this innocent young naive girl, which I just don't value, I don't respect. Obviously there's reality set in that is common or was common. I get that, but it is highly romanticized in a way that is unnecessary in my opinion. They constantly refer to Kai, that's how I'm saying it, if it's, I don't know if it's Kaya, I'm saying Kai, but they constantly refer to Kai as like naive and neglected and innocent and like really like inexperienced and basically this like childlike figure even when she's 15, which she's still very much a child. They refer to her even as like a younger child. So then when this older boy comes in, it feels very much like he's like fetishizing her because he's like taking her under his wing of like, let me teach you how to read and like actually socialize and communicate with people. And it's in a way where you kind of see that he has like ulterior motives because there is like a romantic interest between them, and there even was like a sexual scene between the two of them which he calls like off because he's like, I know this isn't right, but it's still like before that it gets like heated to a point where I'm like, I don't want to read about this because this is like perverted. Like it is like he is fetishizing this like innocent young girl, and then the author goes into detail about how like hot and heavy like this scene is with them, and I don't like that. Like I don't want to read about that. And yeah, sure, maybe that exists in real life, but I think the fault is in the writing and how it was portrayed rather than the actual act of what was happening, because I think you can write about something that's like wrong and uncomfortable in a way that like does not romanticize it, you know? That was my biggest issue with it, because that would like just kind of tainted my image of the story, because I found that really hard to get past. But as for technical things, I just think it was written very immaturely. I think the syntax and overall just the language felt very basic, but like trying to come off as highly intellectual, but it just felt fake because I didn't get that appeal. So regarding the plot, I have a couple things. One is that it felt very predictable. It was full of cliches and things that you would just anticipate to happen. So I'll get a little bit more into that. But the second thing is that it is, in theory, a murder mystery, but they talk about it in the first like 40 pages and then the last like 40 pages, and everything in between is honestly really irrelevant. I think it would have been a much stronger book if Owens just focused on the psychological impacts of being isolated and growing up entirely alone and living off the land, rather than this like murder mystery where it's like this like quirky like girl that is made fun of is like blamed as the biggest suspect for a murder of someone that she like was romantically involved with at one point. And I think that either focus entirely on the murder aspect of it, but then don't have like hundreds of pages that just talk about like other random things that quite frankly don't add that much to the murder mystery aspect of it. It just felt like it like by the time I got to the end of the book, I was like, oh, I like literally forgot that there was a murder and that that was like the intent of the book. So I just thought that it tried to tackle too much. And quite frankly, I just think that the idea of the psychological impacts that like being isolated and living off the land has is so interesting. Like I would have loved to read like a very deep account of how she survived that, and we get a little bit of that, but I still feel like it isn't to the fullest extent, because she knows how to socialize well enough, at least that's how I read it. She knows how to socialize well enough that like it was almost shocking that she wasn't less like cultured. Can understand the interest in this book because it was like entertaining in the sense that like I was able to get through it and it was interesting enough to like want to keep reading, but I don't get why people were so like impressed by it, if that makes sense, because I didn't feel, you know, drawn in by the writing of it, and I didn't really feel drawn in by like a clear plot, and I didn't really get that invested in any of the characters, to be honest. And I think it just fell to these like cliches, which are cliches for a reason. I totally get that. I don't think that there should have been such a large emphasis on those like love story cliches when she in theory should really be struggling with the psychological scenario of being in this land by herself. And yeah, I just didn't feel like there was a place for them as much, because I do understand that there is very much a place for those cliches and classics in a lot of media. And I really hate to like shit on this book because like I said, I get why people enjoy it. I just think that my perspective is like heightened because everybody did enjoy it. But yeah, I'd be super curious to hear everyone's thoughts if you have read it, because I am curious to know more of why. And I did speak with one person about it, and it was like honestly very enlightening in the sense that definitely gained a new perspective, talking about how Delia Owens is a zoologist, so she has this very like animalistic view of people and human nature, which definitely comes through and is something that, like, looking back I can notice really strongly. Yeah, so that was one thing of you know, many in that conversation, but I would be curious to hear your thoughts on this book. And now I've talked about this book for 15 minutes and I have like 8 others to talk about. So here we go. So the next thing I'm gonna talk about is The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which was the first book that I read like in quarantine. And it really only took me a couple days to get through because it was like one of those books that was like almost like debilitating. Like I woke up and I was like, read. Like I like had to sit down and finish it because I could not focus on anything else because all I wanted to do was like finish this book because I needed to know like what was going on, and I was so invested in it, and I have not read a book like that in a hot second. I am going to spoil this book less because I highly recommend it and want everybody to read it because it's phenomenal. But this is also a murder mystery slash like psychological thriller, which is not something that I typically read, but it is so well done. And the characters are so interesting and well thought out, and their dynamics are just like meant to be. Like it is so natural. I read Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch a couple years ago and I did really enjoy it, but I have my gripes with that book, which obviously I won't go into here. But I have a few things with that, so I wasn't like blown away by it. But The Secret History literally is not even comparable to The Goldfinch. It is just so good. And of course, like her writing is always just absolutely gorgeous. Like even throughout The Goldfinch, even with the parts that I was like, you know, had a few things with, which was more of just like the structure of it, her writing is absolutely phenomenal throughout the entire thing. There's no like hesitation with that. And so you get a book like The Secret History where naturally at the very foundation her writing is gorgeous, and then the narrative is so strong and the characters are so strong, and the way that everything connects is just like meant to be. Like it is, in my opinion, something that is so well thought out and it just falls into place. I also think that everything in that book happened at like a great time. Like the pacing was so good because it wasn't trying to tackle too much or like present you with all of these like massive things that happened, but as soon as something was like kind of like a lull, like it was like, oh, here's this new piece of information that adds this like whole new world that connects these 3 points. It just worked very well. I keep saying that same thing because I'm trying to speak in vague terms, but the pacing was also phenomenal. I know after reading some reviews, because I love reading reviews after I finish books, some people had issues with the kind of performative nature of like the emphasis on Greek literature throughout it because they are like Greek students, and I know that some people thought that it was just very like show-offy, and like that was supposed to like present this like prestigious nature because it is in like the setting of like Greek scholars. I felt like it worked though. Like I think that it seems natural that all of these students are like really pretentious. Like I know that people were annoyed that they were pretentious, but I'm like, they're at private school studying like Greek literature and philosophy. Like yes, they're going to be pretentious. That just seems natural. And you know, most of them come from like very well-off families. Like it seems fitting, so I felt like it worked and I felt like there was a place for that. And I think all of their like familial backgrounds were important to like how it contributed to the story and how it contributed to like who they were as a person and how like fucked up they were, because they were all so fucked up in their own ways. Which gets me to my next point, is that I know a lot of people had problems with the characters being very similar, which I never noticed in my read of it, and maybe that was me just like kind of worshipping Donna Tartt throughout this book. I felt like there was enough difference between the characters because yes, a lot of them come from similar backgrounds and have like similar qualities, but I think that their interests and their like just the nature of like the way that Donna Tartt writes dialogue, I think had enough like difference in quality that they felt so different. Like the characters each had their own way of speaking, which I think really contributed to why I didn't feel like they were that similar, because maybe at the base, if you were looking at them on paper, they are very similar, but just the way that they communicate, the like way that they function and exist within this like world felt very unique to me. Basically, I highly recommend this book and it's phenomenal and I would definitely give it another read And shout out to Colm for recommending this to me. I'm so happy that I read this at the beginning of quarantine. It was a great way to start. The next thing I'm going to talk about is Just Kids by Patti Smith. I have a lot of love for this book. I was so inspired while reading this. I just wanted to like create, and I wanted to write poetry, and it was again like a great way to kind of start quarantine, because this was also one of the first books that I read. It was great because I really got into this awesome mindset of just like wanting to like create and to just exist as this artist and exist for art in general, and that was really like motivating and inspiring when I was sitting at home for months at a time, you know? And before I get into this, because I also have another book that I'm going to review of hers, I understand that a lot of people don't love Patti Smith because she doesn't have some crazy like unique story, and she's got a whole lot of privilege. But I do want to acknowledge that like I get that. Like it's not like she has some like inspiring story in the sense that she overcame like boundaries. I just think it's interesting, and you know, she's white, she's got a ton of privilege there. She has experienced so much luck with just who she came in contact with, like not only Robert's connections, but also just like the fact that she was able to live in these places and like work in these spaces that presented these people that just like came out of nowhere. And like obviously I'm not saying that she like didn't work hard, I just mean that she doesn't have a story about overcoming battles. She experienced a whole lot of privilege and a whole lot of luck, and I understand that, but I do think that that still has an interesting story of how she met these people, and how absurd that she met all of these people who like had this huge artistic influence in her life, which I just think is so fascinating. So I do want to mention that I get that she's not some like person to like praise, but I think her writing is gorgeous and I love her mind. So that is why I like Patti Smith, and yeah, I think that's totally valid if you don't love her. This is just such a fascinating story of how her and Robert became involved with each other and how they evolved once they were with each other. I don't know, I think it's really fascinating to read about artists and their like upbringing and how they were connecting with other artists and stuff, just as someone who is like an artist, not in the same sense, but in some realm. Their life is definitely something that gets romanticized, and I definitely did that throughout this book because it's like fucked up that it gets romanticized, because they're just like madly depressed and like living dollar to dollar and like get no sleep. Not something that should be romanticized, but she has a way with writing that you're like, wow, this is just beautiful. And it's like, I know that it shouldn't be, but it does get romanticized. But I also think that that's part of why her writing is so powerful, because she has this way of like looking back on her life and recognizing like, yeah, I was fucking depressed, and yeah, I was really struggling, and yeah, I had no idea what was going on with my relationships and whatever, and I was like being mistreated and XYZ. But here was all this beauty, because life is beautiful, and even when you're suffering, there's still beauty in life, and I think that is something that's really cool, and at least something that I can relate to, because I'm someone who romanticizes things, whether that's fantasizing about stuff in the future or taking apart the good pieces of something in the past and like creating this false image in my head, which yes, is toxic, very much so, but I can relate to that in that sense. But on top of that, yes, some of that may be toxic, but I also think like you're never gonna love shit if you don't romanticize it. Like I can look at this fucking plant on my side table and be like, okay, it's a fucking plant, like that's not that cool. But then if I romanticize it, I'm like, wow, all of the living, breathing, amazing things of this plant and how it came to be, and then it like can spiral into this world of thoughts, and it's like, that can be so beautiful. You know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? That's a terrible example, but I just think like, why not romanticize the shit out of stuff? Obviously be realistic with like, don't romanticize your depression, and I don't think that you have to be depressed to make good art. We all know that's not true. We all know that you don't have to be depressed to make good art. But I do think that there is value in finding beauty and creativity and love and light in just whatever, and finding the good in times that you didn't find the good, you know? So now I'm reviewing M Train, which I read more recently. I do love Patti Smith, and this book clarified that for me, because Just Kids is this like wild, youthful like story of her and Robert and her like creative, artistic world, and then M Train is like her being settled a bit more and like spiraling thoughts and like inside her mind of like just sitting and drinking coffee with like olive oil and brown bread, and like her existing as this much older woman who still finds beauty in the world, but also is reflecting on this like life that she has had while she's still very much like living it. And I think it's fascinating, especially after reading Just Kids. It was like a nice transition because I was like, wow, there's this romanticized, like, gorgeous life that she has, and then she's like reflecting back on this stuff, like, while living a much more like seemingly mundane life, which she'll never have a mundane life because her mind is just crazy, but it seems that way. And so I think that's a really interesting transition, like in the way that you go from Just Kids to M Train. I just think M Train really portrays how your mind can spiral into so many thoughts, and like the way that you reflect on your own life, and like the way that you get through shit. And so I found it inspiring in a much like less obsessive way, if that makes any sense. It just felt very natural and raw, while also like maintaining that kind of mystery of Patti Smith, of like these surreal elements of how she like views the world and how she writes about the world. And I don't know, it was a really, really nice read in my opinion. The next book that I'm going to be reviewing is The Liars Club by Maree Karr. This book took me so long to get in the groove of, like literally so long. I did not want to pick it up. And I have mixed feelings about it, so we'll unpack that a little bit. This is a memoir about Maree Karr's absolutely chaotic, abusive world, and she's able to bring light and humor to like terrible abusive situations while still like being really assertive about what happened and how that's not okay. So she grew up poor in an industrial Texan town, but also partially grew up in Colorado where they moved, and The Liars Club follows both of those experiences in different sections. A trigger warning is definitely needed for this book on abuse, on sexual assault. Yeah, it's intense, and there were some scenes that like really like fucked me up, and I kind of wish I had known. It's obvious that Karr is a poet after like reading this book, and obviously like I knew that going in, but it's very prominent in her writing, even in the form of a memoir, which I really appreciated because I do love like poetic writing and such. And with that, I think her voice is really strong throughout the whole book, but the actual like narrative is honestly really hard to follow. At least in my opinion, maybe because it like took me a long time to get through, so it was kind of spaced out, but I found that it was pretty challenging to get through and to like understand the timeline of stuff, and also how old she was when she is narrating these parts and things of the sort, which I think is just a fault of like the editing, of just structuring the book. And I feel like hesitant almost to talk about this because I don't really know why I couldn't get super into this book, but I will say that I did love like the sheer bluntness of it. Like it just fucking hits you. Like she does not mess around with telling you the facts. Like she's a badass child, and she makes you know that, but also just like you can tell with how she writes things and like what she tells you. I think part of why this book remains very neutral in my head is because it was kind of hard to grab on to any of the experiences she had, because it did jump around so much and it was a little confusing to understand who she was in those moments. Yeah, and there isn't really a hierarchy of events. It's kind of just like, here's what happened. So it's almost feels like she's kind of neutral about what happened, and so you don't really get the emotional connection with these facts that she's telling you. I don't know, I can appreciate the contents of this book, but I'm not crazy about it, and I know after like reading reviews and stuff that people are in the same boat as me, and I also like need to do a little bit more research, because then I was reading some reviews or talking about how like some of the stuff like isn't true, or how it's like very like exaggerated. So that's a whole other topic that's very interesting, and maybe we'll do some more research on that. Okay, I've got a few more books. So I'm gonna talk about The White Album by Joan Didion, which was on my list for literally so long, but I couldn't find it, and then I got it off of Thrift Books. My first experience reading Joan Didion was Slouching Towards Bethlehem, and I loved her writing, and I really wanted to read more by her, so here was that. So basically this memoir is like her recount of like the 60s and what she found like important and innovative and like meaningful, which is such a cool structure for a memoir, which I really enjoyed that structure. I think that's amazing that things like malls can jump out at you, or certain artists that were like super influential in that period of time for you. What you consume and what you see is just as important as like what you're thinking, I feel like, when looking at like memoirs and such, you know? This carries on throughout Joan Didion's writing, I feel like, at least in my opinion, always, but she's very good at giving you beautiful information in very few words. Like she does not need to like spew all of this and go around in circles to tell you like what happened and make it sound good, which is just a product of like good writing. And so I really appreciate that, and I think it also makes it a really great read, really anything by her then, because you don't have to pick it apart in order to like understand or grasp what she's trying to say. And it's interesting comparing this with Maree Karr's writing then, because I feel like my issue with Maree Karr was that she didn't really define how she felt about things, and so it didn't feel important. But then on the other hand, then I look at Joan Didion and I'm like, okay, Joan Didion might not tell me like how important something is, but just by the way that she says it, I'm like, this has influence, you know? This book is great. I don't think it changed my life or anything, but I think it's so fascinating and enriching to like learn about the things that people love or the things that are memorable to people, because that's, again, like I said, just as important as like what we do and what we experience. Okay, my camera's about to die, so I'm gonna see if I can do the last like book or two in like very few minutes. Against Memoir. This book by Michelle T has made it on my list of favorites. This is also kind of the same structure as Joan Didion's White Album, in the sense that it's basically things that were influential in Michelle T's life, and scenarios that she had, and artists that like left an impact on her, or even just were like something that stayed in her head. I impulsively picked this up in Gauge the Word in London because I closed in like 10 minutes and I was with Maree and we really wanted to go, and this was like the only chance that we got. So I also have this like beautiful memory of like getting this book, because then we met the guy that worked there and he was so friendly, and he like literally walked us to this bar that he recommended, and it was great, and it was such a good night. And then I read it and I was like, wow. And there's some essays in here that were just phenomenal. One being How Not to Be a Queer Douchebag. I'm pretty sure that's what it's called, but that literally like, that changed my life. That reading that was incredible, and just her writing phenomenal. I feel like I'm reading a diary entry or like talking with a friend, which is such a fun way to consume information and stories, and just a great queer book and amazing. I love it. Lastly, I'm gonna talk about Pleasure Activism. Gracie lent this to me for my birthday, and I haven't read like every section of it, but what I have read I've loved, and I think that it is also kind of life-changing information, just talking about the importance of pleasure, and especially in relation to like queer and female worlds. And to be able to read about that influence from a bunch of different authors is so enriching, because pleasure is very important, and we all love pleasure in a multitude of ways. And especially in marginalized groups, you have so much discrimination against pleasure, or like so much, I don't know if discrimination is the right word, but you have so much like an emphasis on having marginalized groups not experience pleasure the same way that like non-marginalized groups are. The word I was looking for is white, not non-marginalized, because the only non-marginalized group is white people. Yeah, I'm not going to go too into this, but I did want to include this and recommend this to anyone who is interested in it. I think it's a really informative read, and I feel like has left thoughts circulating in my mind, which I am very thankful for. And I believe that those are all the books that I have read since March. I'm currently reading Middlesex, which I can update you on my Instagram, but currently that is the list that we are working with, and those are some of my thoughts on that. I'm not going to pretend that this was perfectly done, so correct me if I'm wrong anywhere, correct me if you think very differently. Well, not correct me, but just let me know. I think it's interesting to hear all of your opinions, and thank you for listening to me talk for literally so long.